And lights, camera, action.
Hello? Hello?
Just a moment. And good morning from Philadelphia. Frank here.
And James coming in from Westchester, New York.
And this is UFO News Network Sunday. We're here today with Dr. Irena Scott, author of UFOs Today, 70 Years of Lies, Misinformation, and Government Cover-up. And thanks for joining us this morning, Dr. Scott.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
Okay. Well, for folks not familiar with Dr. Scott's background, she's worked as a MUFON investigator, has worked at the Battelle Memorial Institute, has worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and on top of all that, she knows her stuff about UFOs. We'll be getting into a lot of details about that. First off, people who are following the UFO subject today have heard a lot of talk about the recent Pentagon UFO study, especially regarding the work that different Robert Bigelow-controlled organizations like NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science, or BASS, his aerospace wing, has done as part of that Pentagon UFO study. But going all the way back to the 40s, there's usually nothing new in the world of UFOs. The Battelle Memorial Institute was doing, to a large extent, the same type of work, studies, research, and all manner of looking into the UFO phenomenon for the government. Dr. Scott worked there directly, got a lot of internal scuttlebutt about the nature of some of the more advanced work, possibly including study of UFO crash fragments. So if you could, Dr. Scott, tell us a little bit about the Battelle Memorial Institute and tell us a little bit about your work there.
Well, the Battelle Memorial Institute is a very important organization, and it's the world's largest nonprofit independent research and development organization. It's been important, for example, in developing xeroxy, which has changed the world. It's been involved in the fabrication of uranium fuel rods for the first full nuclear scale reactor. It's also managed some important atomic energy sites such as the Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge, and Brookhaven laboratories. And it was important in developing the bomb during the Manhattan Project. It's done a lot of other things too. And at the time, in the early 50s, when they were doing some UFO studies, they had probably the top metallurgists in the world. So it has a good background.
Okay, and a gentleman named Howard Cross was, I believe, one of those metallurgists. I believe that was his specialty, but whether it was or it wasn't, he was involved in some of the UFO research that Battelle took part in the late 40s and into the 50s. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes. He was, as far as I can tell, I'm not sure. I think he was the head of Project Stork at one time, and it started out as a study of what the Russians made or foreign technology. This was before UFOs came in. And it was a very secret project because as they didn't, the military didn't want people to know what they were investigating on other countries. It's probably that type of thing. Foreign technology is probably the most secret of anything now. And when UFOs came in, I can sort of trace the history of UFOs because I kind of know more about Battelle than any place else. When UFOs came in, their study went into this very classified foreign technology division of Project Stork or White Stork because they didn't know whether UFOs were foreign, from another country, or what they were. And so that's one reason the whole thing started out as classified, was because it went into this classified area, the highly classified area of the government to study foreign technology. And it's still foreign technology, so I imagine there's some really highly classified work on it now.
Understood. Okay, now Battelle also put together something for the Air Force called Special Report 14, I believe it is.
Yes. And
oh, okay.
I think this is,
yeah, if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. I think it's probably the best study, in my scientific opinion, of any that's ever been done on UFOs. And it was done in the early 50s. And at that time, it was secret. And Battelle didn't want anybody to know they were working on UFOs, and the division it was under was also secret. So it was a secret study. It's been declassified now. And they did a very scientific study. And they investigated the two most prominent theories about UFOs and had good data to show that something was actually going on. The first theory to refute UFOs is that they're caused by lack of information or by inaccurate perceptions. And they always give examples of this where somebody goes out and says, oh, a UFO, and then they see it better, and oh, it's an airplane. And that's the general idea of UFOs, that they're actually something that's known that people just can't identify at first. And so they did a real good study, and they took around 3,000 of the best sightings of over 7,000 from Project Blue Book. And they found out that the ones that were in the category called excellent, that had very good reporting on the details and very credible reporters and everything, came out a much higher percentage of the unknowns than the very poor reports where somebody just goes out and sees a light. And they did a statistical study, and that refuted that because they had a lot of good data on some of the unknowns that never turned into a known that nobody ever identified. And the second theory is that UFOs are really known, but misidentified objects. And in that case, they did a real good study of if that were true, you would expect the characteristics of UFOs to match, in general, those of conventional objects. For example, a certain percentage of conventional objects are aircraft, and they have predictable lighting arrangements, and a certain percent are meteors, and so forth. And so if you line up the information on UFOs versus prosaic normal aircraft, you'd expect that to come out the same, because if they were just misidentifications. However, Battelle did a really good study using statistical procedures such as chi-squared. And in this case, they found that with a probability of less than 5 or 1%, that these two classifications were different. And so that's the standard they use in scientific studies. If you have two classes of things and you want to know whether they're the same or different, you use the probability. And if it's less than 5%, that's reportable. And they came up with that probability in 5 of 6 categories. And so this was a good scientific study. And it also showed that UFOs are not misidentifications or instances where people don't have enough information. And which proves in the scientific format that UFOs exist.
Got it.
Nobody knows about it.
Okay, sorry, keep going.
Nobody knows about it because the Air Force then said they didn't find anything, and that was untrue. They wrote up in their summary that nothing was found. Well, highly significant results were found, but I think for one thing, nobody knew anything about statistics, and so they didn't understand the results. And most people still don't understand statistics, so they don't realize what a really good study that was.
Now, is this... sorry, has this study since been declassified? Is this available for us to look at now, or is it still buried somewhere?
No, it's been declassified for a long time. It was a Special Project 14.
Okay.
Mentioned.
Yeah, we'll have to look for that and add the link to the description section of the interview when we get it posted. Now, you also worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. Did that work predate your work at Battelle, or did that come after?
I also had some other information about Battelle.
Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely.
This was the Roswell took place in 1947, and nobody knew anything about it until 1980 when the first books were published. But we had a report from somebody that worked at Battelle. I got it secondhand from the person he talked to. But his name was John Center, Elroy John Center. And Battelle had done that study I just talked about, SR 14, Special Report 14, and it was just to do a questionnaire and to do the statistical study. It wasn't supposed to be anything else. But what they did was hire really good top metallurgists to do the study, and that sounds pretty funny to start with, a little bit fishy. And so people at Battelle knew most of the people who were in that study, and they were generally metallurgists. And people closely questioned them. Did they find any material that related to UFOs? And they wouldn't talk. Nobody would. But I found out from this one person that way back before 1957, and probably at the time the secret study was being done at Battelle, this one person said that he was responsible for a project that required him to study parts that they represented as retrieved from a flying saucer. He said one of it had writing on them. And these were like I-beams. And he was supposed to decipher the writing on them. His name was John Sutter, and he's written up in American Men of Science and other places. And he told that during the 1950s, which was a long time before anybody knew anything about Roswell, which suggest that something was going on with metal back then, and he was a metallurgist.
Sure, there are plenty of Roswell witnesses who've said that after the fact, talking about I-beams with writing and so on and so forth. How could they have known?
Well, nobody knew that then.
Exactly, unless they had firsthand knowledge, right?
Right. And I published that about 1993, or 1995 or somewhere, and I didn't even realize how significant it is. I just put it in. I didn't even put a title for it. But in 2007, when Carey and Smith wrote their book, Witness to Roswell, they carried a quote for me about it. And they told the story of John Center, who had assisted on a baffling science assignment that involved the evaluation of a very unusual metal. And after that, that's from a quote from the book. After that, it really got into the news because several other people said, maybe this is memory metal. And it was on the internet for a long time after that, nitronol and memory metal. That you mentioned Dr. Cross. Well, he published with Dr. Cross, and so he would have probably known Dr. Cross and been working with him. And another thing that makes me think it's valid is that when the study was going on, it was secret. It seemed like everybody, like a lot of people, Battelle kind of knew about it, even though it was top secret. But it was reported that he took material home about the UFO study. And because it was secret, I would guess that he probably worked on it with Cross and the other ones.
Now, this is Dr. Center. Oh, okay, this is Dr. Center then. Got it. Okay.
Yes. So I thought this was pretty good evidence that something was going on, maybe with Roswell or somebody was investigating some kind of metal.
And you're picking you're picking this up at Battelle when you're working there several years after they're done and gone their work there, though. Is that about right?
Yeah. I published it in 1992. And I published it in the Ohio UFO Notebook. And it didn't really cause much of a stir until it was published in Witness to Roswell in 2009. And then people became more aware of it. But I talked to the person that talked to Center. I didn't know Center. I wasn't there back then. But I talked to a lot of other people about it too.
So there was still that information, that institutional knowledge that was still kind of floating around within the facility, literally a couple decades or more after all this had taken place. This seems to be that significant that people still remember it that much further before you picked up on it.
Yes. I think they'd done a study in 1952 or something. And I published it in 1992, which was 40 years later. But people were still talking about it, and they still do.
I have no doubt about that. I don't know if you still have any contacts who are working there or anything along those lines, but do you know that Battelle, or I've heard that Battelle might still be doing some work for the government on this subject, the UFO subject?
Well, I've heard they were doing it until recently, but I'm not in contact with anybody that's directly working with anything like that right now.
Got it. Okay. Do you have anything else to add about Battelle?
let me see. Well, one thing interesting that happened to me, several people said that some of the material was stored in a safe at Battelle. I don't think it would be now because I don't think they have enough security to do that. But last year, I was in the Battelle parking lot. I'd gone in to see about something because I'd worked there. And a person had told me that the Project Stork and the UFO work had taken place on the fourth story of this particular building. And they told me there were little rings on the windows that would keep people from reading out what they're talking about with a laser. Apparently, that people can aim a laser at a window and through electronics figure out what people are talking about. And so anyway, I just took out my camera and started taking some pictures of the round things on the windows, and somebody came and threw me off. Told me to leave. And I couldn't believe that because, that was a long time ago when the study took place. Absolutely. But they still have the circle windows.
Guys, just before we move on from Battelle, what initiated the study to be done at Battelle?
It was under Project Blue Book, and it was basically to devise a questionnaire where they could interview a witness on paper and try to get the information on the object they saw, the size and shape and movement and things like that. And the other part was to statistically study the UFO phenomenon.
And I think it's important to note, we didn't get into this, but Battelle is what, maybe an hour's drive from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base?
Yeah, about. It's not too far away.
So that doesn't hurt. I mean, obviously, both places are top-notch facilities, but the location it never hurts.
Well, that's Wright-Patterson was the first known public organization to start investigating UFOs. So they, had local connections, and Battelle was the top metallurgist at that time. So if anything had been found, it likely would have gone to Battelle.
Got it. And their work with the military, I believe, goes back to roughly when it was founded back in the World War I era.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So
I don't know.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. I don't know a lot about it, but yes.
I did a little bit of background on it going back in the day, but sometimes my memory gets a little hazy. But yeah, I believe Battelle was founded back in the World War I era. And back in the day, it was still Wright Field before it became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But that was always the location for the Foreign Technology Division. So, and also they've got the not supposedly, it's been demonstrated through declassified documents that the infamous Blue Room is located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Did you ever hear much talk about that?
Well, actually, I visited Wright-Patterson. I was sent for conferences from work and stayed at the Hope Hotel on base and got to walk all over the base. But I also knew the archivist for Wright-Patterson, and he took us all through the most highly secret buildings there. And another thing I found out that might relate to the recent UFO work by Bigelow and stuff that's been published is that I and another person, he invited us to a meeting about UFOs, and it was in the really top, most secure building there. And I think the Blue Room was in with that. It was the building complex where Blue Book and all those other studies had taken place. So we were right there in the building. I, of course, couldn't take pictures in the building, but I did take pictures of the outside.
And,
And
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
but what happened was we were in this meeting, and the speaker said that everything about Project Blue Book was declassified now. And of course, I didn't believe that at all. And they said, is it declassified? He said, yes, without even hesitating. But anyway, somebody stood up and said, what about the gun camera footage? And that relates, this it's coming up now. And so he immediately said, what he said was, I want to remind you there's people here without clearances, which was me and the other person. But maybe there was more to it. But they knew about the gun camera footage.
Sure. Well, if you've got gun cameras and you have a UFO encounter, it's going to get picked up. I'm sure that there's several hours of it somewhere.
Uh-huh.
Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, it made me think of that, the gun camera footage that's going on now, because they mentioned that, and it sounded like there was a lot more to it than what they said.
Understood. Now, you did end up working for the DIA at Wright-Patterson, either a little earlier or a little later than your work at Battelle. Is that right?
I worked at Battelle later after I worked at the DIA.
Okay. And what did you do with the DIA? Did you have any UFO information come your way while you were there?
Well, what I did for the DIA was I was a GS-11, and that's equal to a PhD. My standard form 50 says I worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. This was in Washington, D.C., and the Photographic Interpretation Office, and it was the Soviet East European Division. So that the work was very, very, very classified at that time because it involved foreign countries. And so I had a real high security clearance. And my work was for the Photographic Interpretation Office was we worked on satellite photography, so that, and this was very classified. It still is, and it's still going on, but and so we were looking at a wide area of the country this was Soviet controlled back then. And I worked in air order of battle, and our job was to identify anything flying across this area. And so we were identifying things like airplanes and looking for the newest airplane development and anything that was flying. And so this was for the DIA. And you would think it would be where they would look for UFOs, because it's satellite photography from a wide area of the country, and they were searching for aircraft. And so the reason this started was something I put in the book that's about to be published. But anyway, I mentioned UFOs to the people, co-workers who were also in photo interpretation. And I expected everybody to just laugh and tease me and harass me and everything else. But that didn't happen. Instead, what they said was that not too long before I came into the section, they had found what they thought was a UFO on their satellite photography film. And it was on two missions. A mission is 90 minutes around, where the satellite takes 90 minutes to go around the Earth. It was in a slightly different place. and it was something they couldn't identify and hadn't seen anything like it. And so they were the country's top photo interpreters for this area and everything, specialists, and just the top intelligence analysis people. And they reported it as a UFO. And our section should be who's looking for UFOs, actually. But nobody ever said anything about UFOs to us, and we had a need to know. But the people came back that we reported it to. It might have been the CIA, but I have a feeling there was a higher government echelon than that. But they said we didn't see anything, that this was a spot on film, and we just didn't know what we were doing. I mean, I looked at it later, and it obviously wasn't, because it was on 2 films. You could see them both in detail. And so the head of my department sent it to some specialists to look at it. I think they're called, they call it sensing density. I think it's density or whatever. And they said, no, that's not a spot on the film. That's something real. And they reported that to the higher-ups again. And their higher-ups again said, no, you're seeing things that's spot on the film. And that was just a totally ridiculous thing to say. And it wasn't professional either, because, like, if they had made a mistake, the higher-ups should explain where the mistake is, because that was important work on, spying on another country, and, it could relate to wars and things like that. And so they were pretty amazed, and nobody laughed at me when I mentioned that.
Got it. So the experts are getting overruled by the bureaucrats, essentially, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, they were. But in relation to the Bigelow information that just came out, well, and that has something to do with the DIA too, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Well, I thought way back then that there's some really high classified area in the government that studies UFOs, because I couldn't figure out why they would give such a ridiculous answer to us and claim it didn't exist, just like we're just came out of an insane asylum or something, when we were the specialists. And so with that, with the Bigelow study, Reed and everybody, I kind of viewed that as sort of a branch. I mean, they got it into the government and everything, but I had the feeling that there's something way higher than that that's studying UFOs, just from my experience with the DIA, and that they'd been probably studying it for a long time.
Understood. Well, since we're on this track, a very interesting bit of information became available through Channel 8 in Las Vegas. That's the station that George Knapp works for, does a lot of interviews, and has been covering the UFO subject when it heats up for decades now, I believe. And this is at their site, the LasVegasNow.com site. We'll post a link to this as well. But it's a statement from a senior manager of BASS, which is Bigelow's aerospace company. And basically what he says, and from this, what I want to lead into is some questions about the research of Harley Rutledge. From several years ago. I thought that was a pretty interesting topic that you go into a great bit of detail about. But what it says here is one sentence from the statement from this unknown project manager who works for BASS. This novel approach aimed to circumvent the increasing evidence of deception and subterfuge by the UFO phenomenon, in that multiple eyewitnesses co-located in the same vicinity frequently reported seeing widely different events. So the evidence was multiplying that the UFO phenomenon was capable of manipulating and distorting human perception, and therefore eyewitness testimony of UFO activity was becoming increasingly untrustworthy. Now, going back to Rutledge, I note in your book that he set up an experiment or a study to look at UFOs. And what he came across was he would set up recording instruments of different types to try to record these videos, or excuse me, this data, this information. And the results that he was getting is the UFOs seemed to know that they were being recorded, that this gear was being set up, and took proactive measures to avoid being recorded. Is that about right?
Yes, I wrote to him for several years, and that was right. And he also, they set up a viewing area. It was like Harold Cross recommended from Battelle. Battelle had a real good idea about setting up a particular viewing area and monitoring everything, and even putting out some different things that might be interpreted as UFOs and studying the reaction. And this was, they were going to use mass spectrometry and different things like that to interpret the photographs they were taking. And it was just an excellent idea that it was in the Pinnacle memorandum, but I had a lot more information than that for the actual study they were going to do. But the government didn't fund it, and that would have been just a super good study where they would have found out a lot. But that's kind of like what Rutledge did. He had a study area, and he set up viewing stations. And this is just like you do, with a regular scientific experiment. If you were studying animal behavior or something, he set it up the same way. And so they could telephone each other from station to station and watch a UFO come. And sometimes the UFOs did these things such as they would be traveling along, like they were just busily traveling along, and then make a detour around a station and things like that.
Okay, and the time frame for this, just to clear it up for folks listening at home, I was not familiar with Rutledge's work, and I like to think that I know a lot about this subject. There's always new things to find out. The time frame for this is roughly the early 70s when he was doing this work.
It was early in 1973. He continued for then on. But what was interesting about his work is that there was a flap or a wave going on. And so normally if you wanted to photograph a UFO, you could sit in a field your whole life and not see anything. But at that time, there was a whole lot of sightings. And so they had an ideal situation to set up their study, because that's just something that doesn't happen. And so they were very lucky on that. And he's a physics professor, and he was the head of the department. And so he was very well qualified, and he set up the stations with other scientists.
Got it. So, okay. Let's, you also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, the UFOs seem to be interactive with them, and they study their behavior besides just studying the physical properties. And he said when certain UFOs came within the range of measurement, they would move, change course, or halt. And on 30 occasions, the movements of the object synchronized with the actions of the observers. And the objects sometimes responded to the observers by switching their lights off and on. They responded to verbal and radio messages, pointing and aiming, and things like that. And the UFOs would respond to that by such things as switching their lights off and on and things like that. So they actually had a recording of the UFOs responding to things they did. And one of the most amazing things I've looked at was the UFOs, for some reason, would disguise themselves as a star and somehow they would get right between the observer and the star, which is just impossible to do, and look like the star in the right position. And I have no idea why they were doing that, but he reported it a number of times, and that would be really, really hard to do.
Exactly. This sounds like some. This sounds like some kind of a weird. This behavior sounds like some kind of weird variant on the double slit experiment, almost.
Uh-huh.
Do you have anything more on Rutledge and his work?
I have quite a bit, and I have a lot about it in my next book that's coming out.
Okay.
The Lightning Bolt.
Then let's wait for that. Then we'll get to plugging your new book before we wrap up here. Also, you've done some MUFON investigating field work. And there have been a number of great cases in Ohio. A couple of them that really stand out that have gotten a lot of attention over the years. One is the famous Portage County police car chase that some folks, if they've ever seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that was actually dramatized, at least to an extent, with the cars chasing the UFOs, where Richard Dreyfuss is forced off the road, nearly gets hit by the speeding police cars, and they drive across the state line and all that. But that is actually based on a real case where some police from Portage County, Ohio, which is a good 30 to 40 minutes from the Ohio-Pennsylvania line, were following a UFO traveling east, and they followed it all the way into Pennsylvania. You did some follow-up work on that case, and why don't you give the folks a little bit of details about that and what you did?
I was able to get the original report and look it over. And I think this is one of the best sightings ever because it was interactive. And one thing really amazing about it was that the police were in contact with, the police were the sighters, and they were in contact with their office the whole time by radio, the whole time that went on. And I also think that it was probably something the government knew about because there were several portions of it where there was either some information that was disguised or some information such as that they scrambled jets and things like that. It took place in April 1966, and it was the people that saw it were Deputies Farr and Neff, who were two policemen. And it started out in Michigan, which is another thing that made me think the government knew about it. Somebody in Michigan had reported that in Benton Harbor, that they saw an object of such really dazzling brightness that they couldn't even look at it. And Spar and Neff were doing some police work, and they heard about it, and they laughed. And that changed from a laugh pretty soon. Anyway, they were investigating a car that was off the road. And they saw, interesting enough, the car had an emblem of a triangle and a bolt of lightning and the word 7 steps to hell. But while they were investigating this car, they saw this bright object in the sky. They had just laughed at the report from Michigan. And they saw it kind of rise from the horizon, and they thought it was about 75 feet overhead, and it bathed them in a real bright light. Well, they were pretty terrified. And it was very close to them and just as bright as you could imagine. And so they called their police office and asked what to do. And they were on the radio from then on. Well, their higher-up said, shoot it. And they had really big second thoughts about that. So they didn't. They got in their police cruiser because they were afraid of getting burned because the light was so bright.
Let me jump in here really quick. There was a follow-up article from local media in Portage County within the last couple of years where they interviewed Neff's son, and he said that his dad told him that he literally felt the heat from this UFO. He felt it, like it was warm in the area because of the UFO.
Well, I believe that because they were just terrified, and they thought they might be burning. And, I mean, it was a real bright light right over them. And I guess they heard a hum like a transformer, too. He was described himself as petrified, and he was afraid he couldn't even move. And then he moved, and then they both ran for the car. So it was a pretty traumatic experience right at the beginning.
And so from Portage County, I'm not sure exactly how far they kept following the object into Pennsylvania, but that's probably the better part of even at high speeds, at least 45 minutes to an hour chase that they were following this.
Well, it was a lot more complex than that because the UFO apparently was interactive, and they reported several times that when it went over a city, it would rise up and go over it and then come back down. And they also reported that when they got delayed, that the UFO stopped and waited for them. So it was something that was aware. I mean, it was interactive. And they followed it through several roads, but they were on the police radio the whole time. And there were a whole lot of other witnesses, including policemen, that also saw it. And they also, with several airports, there were newspaper articles that people had watched jets being scrambled to chase it. The Air Force never admitted that, but people saw it. I mean, one of them was Youngstown Air Base Airport.
Yep.
Jets had scrambled, but the thing only went about 100 miles an hour. So they couldn't follow it with jets because of its speed. It was pretty slow. And there were a number of other policemen that joined the chase, too. And they also saw the moon and Venus at the same time. They also, at the greater Pittsburgh airport, the air traffic controller confirmed that an object was being monitored on their radar. And there was also chatter on the police radio about jets being scrambled. And so this was just an amazing sighting.
Yeah, that was a great case. Oh, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Well, they thought that the object was monitoring their radio calls to their office. And in one place, they said they started talking about fighter planes. And just like that, the UFO just shot up when they said that. A lot of interaction there, actually. But it turned out really bad because the Air Force said that they hadn't seen anything. They had seen Venus. They chased it through all this, like you said, many, many miles with different policemen and everything else. But the Project Blue Book head said, well, you saw Venus. And so they were just running for their lives, and it just ruined their lives, everybody that was connected with it.
Now, another case I'm sorry, keep going if you have more.
No, that's okay.
Okay. Now, another big case that took place in Ohio, a very famous case, was the Coyne helicopter case involving a National Guard helicopter piloted by Lawrence Coyne, and he had an interaction with a UFO that was also witnessed by civilians on the ground. And you've taken a closer look at that case as well. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. This was the Coyne case. They were on their way from Port Columbus to the Cleveland International Airport and just flying around their helicopter. I think it was really late at night. And it was in 1973, which was when the flak that Rutledge also had studied the UFOs. There was a big flap at that time. They at first just saw this light out and they didn't pay too much attention to it and thought it was a jet. But then they noticed it was coming toward them real fast. And then they thought they were going to crash, and the Coyne put it into a dive, and the object hovered right above them. It was a big object. I mean, they could very vaguely see a dome with windows and things that had lights on it, a red light and a white light and a green light. And the thing stopped right above them. It wasn't for very long, but it certainly wasn't a meteor. And I heard, I was at a radio station listening to somebody debate a debunker, and the debunker said, "Oh, that's a meteorite." Well, I mean a meteor, but it wasn't, because it hovered over him, not for very long, but it hovered over him, and it also changed course. And the object shined a green light down on him while it was hovering over him. And the light shined into the cabin. It turned the whole cabin green, and they said it hit him directly in the face. And so what happened then was that they were in this nosedive, and they were about to hit the ground, and they suddenly discovered they were way up in the air. So that this beam not only was something they saw, but it was also seemed to be some form of tractor beam that caused them not to crash into the ground. It was a very, very bright beam, because people even saw it on the ground, and it lit up the ground below it. And
yeah,
there also
I'm sorry, keep going.
No, what? No. What?
Well, yeah, I was also going to say there was quite a few ground witnesses to this incident as well. It wasn't just the guys in the helicopter.
Yeah, and the ground witnesses saw the direction everything was going to, so it wasn't just the people in the helicopter thinking it had stopped over them and changed course and things. The people on the ground saw that too. And I go into this a little more in my new book too, but they said that the magnetic compass was rotating 4 times per minute, and the altimeter suddenly read way up where they thought they were nosediving, which they would be hard to explain, but you'd think that maybe there was something in the beam that was throwing off their compass or something. And I interviewed an electrician about that, and that's in my new book too, what he had to say about it.
Got it. So you've got the book that's already out, the one that I read, UFOs Today, 70 Years of Lies, Misinformation and Government Cover-up. Tell us about the new book that's coming out.
Well, my new book is to refute the general idea that's used to attack UFOs is that it's not accepted by scientists. No scientists ever see UFOs, and there's nothing about it in the scientific literature. And that's what they use to refute UFO phenomena, ever since it started. But what my new book is about is reasons for refuting this, and it's somewhat personal. And this is because I have scientific training. I've been a professor and have a PhD and everything, so I could say, I have scientific training and work in science. Well, I've also had UFO experiences too, and with other people. And so I covered that in my book, but I also reported some of the information to the scientific literature. I submitted it to scientific journals, and it was accepted and published. And so when they said there's nothing in peer-reviewed scientific journals about UFOs, well, there is, because I put some in, and I show the papers in my book. One interesting thing was when I was working for the DIA, what caused me to originally bring up the subject of UFOs was that my sister and I had just had an experience with them. And they always say, just crazy people see UFOs. You have to be a lunatic. You have to escape from the asylum and things like that. Well, I was working for the DIA. I had a PhD level job, and I had high security clearances that take years to get. And I wasn't crazy or anything. And my sister was going to postgraduate work at Drew University. And we weren't, the last thing we were thinking about were UFOs, but we were both on the East Coast, and so we decided to go up and see the New England states. I was in Washington, D.C., and she was in Madison, New Jersey. And so I took some coworkers with me and went to Madison, New Jersey, and took pictures of her and the coworkers and everything by her dorm. And then we left and we wanted to see Boston. And so we drove up to Boston. Well, we got there and it was still daylight. And so we decided to just go up and see more of the New England states. And we went around the outer belt of Boston, which in that time was Route 128. And then we went on Route 3 up into New Hampshire. Well, I found out later that we were in the area where some of the Betty and Barney Hill observation or experience took place. And we didn't know that then. And we came back to Boston and started looking for motels. We didn't find anything. And this was before, it was in 1968, before cell phones or anything. And so we were coming out of Boston. I think it was on Route 9. And my sister kept looking to the south, and we saw this really funny thing. We could see airplanes going by that were landing at an airport in the area, but there was this really funny thing also in the air. There was a light. It was blinking a lot differently than a strobe light or anything. We didn't see any other lights on it. It seemed to be following the freeway very low. And my sister kept saying, look at that, it's different. And apparently she said, I didn't notice it because I was driving. She said it'd be one place and then it'd just be another place. And you couldn't even see it going from one place to another, but it was very distinctive, so you couldn't miss what it was. And so we hadn't been allowed to talk about UFOs when we were kids, although we probably had a sighting when we were younger. And I mentioned that to her, and she said she'd had a sighting too, and we'd never talked about that before while we were on the road looking at this thing. So we went down 95, and we just had a bunch of really weird experiences that you couldn't believe. And so that's why I brought up the subject of UFOs at work. So anyway, I go into detail about what happened to us in the book, in my new book.
Got it. Okay. Now, getting back to the book that's out now, UFOs Today. You also worked at Ohio State and know Jerry Eamon, the famous WOW signal scientist, at least a little bit. Can you tell us about your interactions with him? And did he tell you anything that might give you our listeners some additional insight into that odd incident?
Yes. There was recently a exhibition at Columbus at the museum of the work at the Big Air Telescope, and that's where Jerry Eamon worked. And so I got to see him very recently, and I took pictures of him and Bob Dixon, who ran the telescope, who was the director, and put them on Facebook. And they're on Facebook, November the 13th, 2017, on my Facebook page, if anybody wants to see recent pictures. This was a WOW signal, and it may be the only communication ever made with ET. It's never been reproduced. I worked at the telescope, and what they were doing is SETI, searching for extraterrestrial signals. But before that, it's a radio telescope, and they were also doing a sky survey to make a map of radio sources. And it was during the SETI work where they found where he found the WOW signal. And the reason it's called the WOW signal was because it was very, very strong. It was just things were going around normal. Suddenly this huge signal came in, and it had the right format for something that was actually out there in space. The telescope it had a big screen on one side, and it funneled the signals into another area where they worked on them electronically and got the signals. So it's a different telescope because it didn't move like the round telescopes they have now. It used the Earth's movement to survey parts of the sky. And so it was a different framework, but they could tell by the trace of the way the signal came in, whether it was just something normal or something abnormal. This was definitely abnormal. I worked on it looking for unusual sources and things, and I didn't find anything of what I looked, but you could see where the sun was going through and things like that with it. And so I was talking to him recently, and it was pretty neat because they had a display. It was the Ohio Historical Society, and they made a WOW signal documentary, and this was a premiere. And what was interesting to me was that I got a message from an astronomer that said one of my UFO books was on display at it was in their display that they put up. So I thought that was pretty cool. And the signal has never been explained. There's been some explanations that don't make too much sense, but they still haven't figured out anything or reproduced it.
Got it. Okay, and he's still pretty proud of himself for having found it. Then I assume, after all these years.
Well, he looks really good. I put a picture of him on my. If I had time, I would have sent it to you.
Yeah, I definitely would have included that in our slideshow. But one thing we do have, you're probably not able to see it on your end, but we've got a lot of the illustrations from your current book, and the illustration work that was done for that book is nothing short of fantastic. It's not only a really good book in terms of covering literally everything that's come up in the UFO field over the last 70 years, but also your personal insights and personal experiences as well. So it's a terrific book. I don't buy that many UFO books, but I bought yours and it was well worth the price. So I strongly recommend it.
Thank you very much. It took a lot of work to write it, but I'm very happy with it.
Oh, and one little personal aside here. I exchanged emails with Tony Bergalia this morning and mentioned that you were going to be on the show today. And he says to say hello.
Well, say hello to him, too. I haven't talked to him for a while. He did the work on the memory medal.
He did. He's done a lot of work in that area. I'm still trying to get him to come on the show, but he doesn't like doing interviews too much, not even for me. I can't figure it out. But one of these days I'll get him.
Well, he did a lot of really good research into Battelle and memory medal and nitronol and all that.
He did. When I first started getting seriously into this subject myself, not quite a decade ago now, it was him that really got me into it, because I thought he really had some good ideas and was looking in the right places as far as the best UFO information out there. So I was a fan of his early on, and we've become friends since then, and he's still doing good work. He still is. Okay, just to wrap up here on my end, one really interesting anecdote that you have in your book that I'd never heard before was related to Cordell Hull, who was at one time the Secretary of State of the United States during the 1940s, also a Nobel Peace Prize winner. In the book, you have an anecdote where Cordell Hull showed someone actual alien bodies that were located, and they said that Hull showed them these alien bodies. Can you go into a little bit of detail about that story?
Yes, he was a very prominent person. He received the Nobel Prize in 1945, and Roosevelt had asked him to run as vice president, but he didn't do it. So he was a very high on the echelon of government people. And Bill Jones, who I worked with, and I went to interview people, his Hull's cousin was a Reverend Holt. And we got the information from Holt's two daughters. We interviewed him in 1999. Bill wrote it up, and he wrote it up with one of the daughters. And my name's just in it, but I'm not an author of it. And I think it was the very first interview anybody done with about this case. We went to see him in the house of one of the daughters, and she had pictures and things and told about her sister. But the story is that her father was the cousin of Hull, and that one time he was visiting Washington, and Hull took him into a chamber which was under the White House, or under the Capitol building, I'm sorry, and showed him this this craft, sort of, with a real funny color and everything, and bodies that were in formaldehyde in jars. And this was way back at, the daughter thought it was 1939, which was quite a bit before the modern age of UFOs.
Right.
And so we investigated some, such as trying to find out what was under the White House, the Capitol. And I think there are chambers under the Capitol, but back then, that might have been where they kept the most secured things they had, might be under the Capitol. And so there's no way to prove it. but both the sisters remembered their father telling about it. It also was interesting because Paul knew Roosevelt, and about the time of the formation of the United Nations, this had kind of appeared, and some other people, I kind of wondered if finding out maybe that there's UFOs and other life forms might have had something to do with forming the United Nations.
Got it. Well, James, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. Do you have anything for Dr. Scott before we wrap up?
No, she touched on most of the stuff that I was thinking about anyways.
Got it. So, jam-packed with information. Another fantastic show. Dr. Scott, do you have anything for us?
Well, my new book's coming out in June.
In June, okay.
Inside the Lightning Ball. Scientific study of lifelong UFO experiencers. And the basic idea is to refute the idea that science doesn't have anything to do with UFOs.
Got it. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, Dr. Scott. Again, another show jam-packed, filled with fascinating information that is not commonly known about the UFO subject. Thanks again, and you have a great day.
Well, you do too, and thank you very much for having me.
No problem. And when your new book comes out, we'll be happy to have you on again.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
And don't forget about the book that's available now. That is, hang on a sec. Let me get back to the screenshot of that. UFOs Today, 70 Years of Lies, Misinformation, and Government Cover-up. Available at Amazon. Very easy to find.
And I go through the cover-up from the very beginning of ufology up to today. So, and the pictures are also great. So,
yeah, the illustrations are fantastic. I was really surprised. It's a lot more book than I was expecting when I got it. I was kind of thinking I was going to be able to buzz through it pretty quick, but that's not been the case. I've had it, I think, for about a month now. And I've gotten through most of it. I still haven't gotten through all of it, but at least I was able to find some new and exciting stuff that I could ask you about. And I would think that it's going to be new information for a lot of people who are listening in, especially the Rutledge study, which is really fascinating stuff. So thanks again, Doctor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You have a great day.
You do too.
Bye-bye now.
Take care.
Bye.
And James, another successful show in the book.
Yeah, that I learned definitely a lot of stuff, and it's very interesting how they had the connection with the Rutledge study.
Yeah, I was really surprised. It's funny because I was going to ask Dr. Scott about that, and then just last night I see this this little article from the Bigelow project manager talking about essentially the same kinds of things that Rutledge found almost 50 years ago now. It's like it's fascinating, and the connections are all over the place. Yet to a certain extent, there's really nothing new under the sun in terms of UFOs. This is a consistent, well-known phenomenon.
Yeah, and that's something I think that George Knapp talks a lot about, and Jeremy Corbell, and especially referring to the Skinwalker Ranch, which is probably where the Bass studies were taking place.
Yep. Well, next week we've got coming up Stanton Friedman, who is probably, if there was a Mount Rushmore for UFO researchers, his face would probably be right up there with three others. I don't know who the three others would be. I'd have to think about it. But he would definitely be in there. Hynek would be in there. Jacques Vallée, maybe.
Jacques Vallée, yeah.
And somebody else. We'd have to think about it. Maybe Kehoe. Maybe Kehoe would be the fourth guy. I don't know. True. Have to think about that. But Stanton Friedman's going to be with us, and we're going to have as much fun, if not more, next week than we did this week. So you got anything else for everybody, James?
No, it's just going to be our special birthday episode.
That's right. Your birthday is next Saturday, is it?
Yeah, May 12th, Saturday.
Okay, and mine will be the date that we have Stanton Friedman on, next May 13th. So everybody have a great rest of your day and a good week ahead. And thanks for joining us.
Take care.